Good afternoon. Thank you so much for coming. We're really happy to have everybody here today. As Dr. Hill said, my name is Dr. McGuire. Can everyone hear me even in the back? It's all loud and clear? Super. Okay, and just as a quick reminder, if your cell phone is still on, you should probably turn that off right now. So go ahead and do that. Okay, so today we're presenting for you what are known as the Niles-Merton song cycles. They're the poetry of Thomas Merton set to music by the singer-songwriter John Jacob Niles in the 1960s. John Jacob Niles, known to his friends as Johnny, was born in Louisville, Kentucky in 1892. He was the oldest of 5 children, and his parents exposed him to music from an early age. I don't know what you were doing when you were teenagers, but he was traveling around the Appalachian region collecting folk tunes, noting them down, and then creating his own musical arrangements and then performing them at whatever, it wasn't coffee houses in 1892, but some sort of public venue. And so he began to build a bit of a reputation for himself in the Louisville area, even in his teen years. But then World War I broke out, and so he enlisted as a pilot, and he was in a near-fatal crash in 1918, which left him hospitalized in France for a pretty substantial time. When he was released, when he was healthy again, he remained in the country to study music formally in Paris and Lyon. Afterwards, he returned to the States to study opera performance at the Cincinnati Conservatory from 1920 to 1923. From there, he landed a position in the Chicago Lyric Opera Chorus, but he only stayed there for about 6 months because he felt a call to pursue a solo performance career. And so, like all good musicians, he packed everything and moved to New York City and entered kind of the folk music scene. So he was known for his unusually high singing voice. If you go home and Google John Jacob Niles and you look for some YouTube videos, it's kind of striking, his voice. It's a very high tenor, and he can flip into a falsetto seamlessly. And it is kind of surreal to hear his voice. Very distinctive, very unique. The label RCA picked him up as their only folk musician on an exclusively classical label at the time. In 1936, he married the daughter of 2 prominent Russians who had fled communist oppression. And the new couple settled on a large farm outside of Lexington, Kentucky, where they lived until Niles' death in 1980 of heart failure. So he is the composer that we're listening to today. The other figure in the Niles-Merton songs is Thomas Merton, who's a major spiritual writer in the 20th century in the English-speaking world. So Merton was born in Prades, France in 1915. He was the older son of 2 artists. His mother, Ruth, attended Quaker services on Sundays, but really never gave her 2 boys any formal religious formation. And his father, Owen, was deeply spiritual, but never attended any formal religious services. So even though he had fairly spiritual parents, he himself had no doctrinal training and no real background at all in religion. Sadly, Merton's mother died when he was just 6 years old, and almost immediately his father began moving from place to place, pursuing his painting career. And he took Thomas with him, leaving the younger son, John Paul, behind with their grandparents in Flushing, New York. So Thomas and his father settled in a small village in southern France, where he attended primary school. His father then moved them to England, and just, kind of as a side note, Merton, even though he lived in America for the vast majority of his life, always considered himself more British than American, even though he had his American citizenship. He just sort of resonated with English culture. So Merton attended high school there. And during this time, again, tragically, his father developed a brain tumor, and his father died when Merton was 16. He decided that he was interested in literature, and he went to Cambridge to begin his university studies. However, and take this as a warning note, his partying and excessive spending were so great in his first year that his guardian advised him to leave and go to school in New York, where he would be better suited. So, cautionary tale, near where his grandparents lived. This does not have a sad ending. He goes to Columbia. So, I mean, it's not the worst thing for him. So Merton finished his undergraduate work in English Lit at Columbia and proceeded to complete a master's degree there as well, writing his thesis on the poet William Blake. And it's during these years that two things in particular happened. He began to write poetry regularly, and the seeds of faith that had been planted at different stages of his life, maybe seeing the cathedral and hearing the bells in the little French town where he went to elementary school, attending chapel service at Oakham where he went to high school, the professors that he had at Columbia who were teaching him Blake, and sort of opening up the spiritual life through poetry to him. All of these little seeds began to germinate. In 1938, then, he was baptized into the Catholic Church when he was 23, and he went on to teach English at St. Bonaventure's, which is a Franciscan college in New York State. Perhaps you've heard of it. There, Merton began to feel the strong pull to a priestly vocation. And because he was in a Franciscan community, he initially explored becoming a Franciscan, but he was ultimately turned down from the order because he disclosed that he had fathered an illegitimate child while he was at Cambridge, and at least at this point in time, that was a non-starter. So after some months wrestling with his calling in life in 1941, so this is when he's about 26, he entered the monastery of Our Lady of Gethsemane in rural Kentucky, where he had been on retreat a few times before, to begin his life in what he believed really was his true vocation, that of a Trappist monk. So monks in the Trappist order live in complete silence in order to more readily enter into contemplation. But they're not hermits. They live in community and they work and pray together in silence. So I'll pause for a moment and let you think about that. So Merton spent much of his early years at this monastery in Gethsemane in silent contemplation, largely intending to give up writing, which before this he'd been really passionate about. I mean, he had a master's degree, he was teaching, he was writing novels, he was writing poems, essays, letters. He just very prolific writer. Although even in the monastery, he continued to keep a journal, to write letters, and to write poems. In fact, before entering the monastery, all those early manuscripts that he had, he burned, except for his collections of poems. Those he brought with him into monastic life. Those were the one things from his early life that he felt really still retained value. As a monk in 1944, he published his first book, which was a volume of 30 collected poems. His abbot started to recognize Merton had real writing talent, and that he had a very distinctive, unique, personal journey into the monastery. And so his abbot asked him to write an autobiography of his spiritual life and his conversion. So Merton complied and published his most famous work, The Seven-Story Mountain, in 1948. And that came out just about a year before he was ordained a priest. The book just flew off the shelves. It was speaking to a generation that had just gone through World War II. So it was immensely popular, and it brought both Merton and this monastery of Gethsemane into the spotlight. They became famous. So now you have all these novitiates coming into the monastery, and what was once a very small rural monastic community really bloomed, and suddenly they were building new dormitories, new refectories, because there are so many people who are feeling called to this contemplative life because they read Merton's book. And they're bringing the monastery money as well. So the abbot says, keep writing, right? So while he'd intended to set aside his passion for writing in his monastic vocation, and he struggled with the role that writing played in relation to his contemplative calling, because his religious superiors asked him to, and really his own conscience was guiding him in this way as well, Merton continued to write prolifically for the rest of his life. He has numerous books. If you go to Wikipedia, for a lot of authors, it's just a tab on their name page, what's their bibliography. Merton's bibliography has its own Wikipedia page. That's how much stuff he wrote, okay? So He continued to write a lot of poems, some observing the beauties of nature from a Zen perspective. In the 60s, towards the end of his life, he got really into Zen Buddhism. Some illuminating Catholic devotions and feasts, and others speaking about the pain of loss or the pleasure of love. Even though Merton was arguably much stronger in his prose, poetry had this hold on him, and he wrote these poems continually throughout his life, even when he was taking a break from other types of writing. For him, it was perhaps the most compatible genre of writing with his spiritual vocation. In 1968, on his first trip away from the monastery, since he had entered it in 1941, Merton traveled to Thailand to give a talk at a conference on monastic practices in Eastern and Western spirituality. But there, in the middle of a conference that he was giving, he accidentally electrocuted himself on a fan, grabbing a fan as he stumbled. He was slipping, getting out of the bathtub. He was buried back home at Gethsemane a week later. And as I said, he's still considered one of the greatest American Catholic spiritual writers, and his works are still widely read by Catholics and spiritual seekers of all stripes today. So, interestingly, Niles, the composer, and Merton, the poet, didn't meet until 1967, so a year before Merton's death. Niles's farm was about an hour away from Merton's monastery, and the two shared an interest in Zen Buddhism. Niles had been a fan of Merton's poetry, and he was looking, even though he was primarily a folk musician, to go back to his more classical roots and write some art songs in a classical style. So even though Niles typically wrote his own lyrics and then set them to music, he took the poems of Merton, which says a lot because this is a man who had, for his whole career, written his own lyrics. And he settled on Merton's poetry as being the thing that most resonated with him. He had Merton's full approval, but there was no direct collaboration about the texts other than some correspondence about which ones would be used. But most of the compositional decisions were made entirely by Niles. Only 10 of the 22 poems chosen had been set when Merton died so tragically. So unfortunately, he never heard the completed work, although anecdotally we have evidence that he heard at least 3, some people say up to all 10 of those early pieces before he died. We know for sure that he heard in person the first song on our program today, a responsory, 1948. So the songs are primarily composed in a classical style, with some postmodern influence, but also quite a bit of folk influence, reflecting Niles's formal musical training in his 20s. And these are true art songs, so I don't know if that's a category that you're familiar with, but these are poems, very lyrical poems set to very lyrical music, and the accompaniment really plays as much of a role in the song as the voice. So don't be fooled or lulled into just listening to Betsy's beautiful voice. Listen to the piano line as well, because it's doing its own thing, and sometimes they're working together, and sometimes they're contributing entirely different things to set the tone for the piece. So as I said, Niles set 22 of Merton's poems into 2 opuses, or groupings, or song cycles, as he called them. And I don't know if that's a term that you're familiar with, but a song cycle is a group of short songs where a single composer chooses a single poet to set the works, and there's some thematic continuities, both in the lyrics and in the musical choices that are made. So it's designed to almost have a narrative arc to it. I don't know, do any of you have ever listened to a whole record before? Can I just see a couple hands if you listen to a record? Will, surely. No? Oh, okay, wow, okay. So records used to be these things that you listened to from start to finish. And they told a story, and they did something. You wanted to hear the whole thing. It didn't used to be, okay, I'm gonna pick this one song off of it. That used to be something you had to pay extra for, a single on a cassette tape, right? So the song cycle is meant to be like an album in a way. It's a whole. designed for you to get a bigger picture with a variety of different things going on in the middle. So there are 22 pieces, and we've chosen a representative 8, because 22 is too long. So we're doing 8 today. And we've provided copies of the lyrics of the poem, so hopefully you were able to pick those up as you were walking in. And I invite you to take a look at those now, if you have them. So the text of the first song, Responsory 1948, is from Merton's third collection of poems, The Tears of Blind Lions, which he published in 1949. The piece opens with a few measures of what I would consider really lush accompaniment in the piano, which moves in this kind of quickening arpeggio upwards, followed by a falling scale. And after these few measures of introductory material, the piano changes into a motif of bells chiming, just as the voice enters. The first lines of the poem, you can see they're repeated, italicized, a little bit lower down. And this was unusual for Merton. He typically wrote through-composed poems that don't have a repeated refrain. But in this case, he brought that text back. And so listen to how Niles chose to represent that. He had a repeating melody line, and the tonality is going to be different between the refrain and the verses. As you can see, perhaps the title of this talk, Wine from Ivory, is taken from the opening lyrics of this song. The image refers to the beauty and the superabundance in human life, even after death, when we're invigorated by a spiritual or an interior life. The melody in the vocal line moves in downward scale patterns, which are then echoed by the accompaniment. And you might notice that while the refrain is quite melodic and lilting, the verses switch to this kind of darker tonality, moving from a major key to a minor key. And the final verse, the accompaniment plays a kind of funeral march, anchoring the vocal line, which rises higher and higher as this interesting counterpoint, because the text is saying, down, 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 the white armies fall. But the melody is actually moving up, 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 and intensifying. So it's an interesting contrast. However, the piece returns to and concludes with the opening refrain with its bell peals, its major tonality, and the lyric melody. The second piece is called The Weathercock on the Cathedral of Quito, and it's actually by an Ecuadorian poet, Jorge Carrera Andrade, and it was translated into English by Thomas Merton. So this was not an original piece to him. Again, Niles' accompaniment begins with bell-like peals, almost as though you're at the cathedral, and it sort of has the effect of drawing your eyes upward to look at the bell tower, and lo and behold, what's at the top of the bell tower? The weather vane with the rooster spinning around, right? So the bells cause us to look upward, and the sun is shining in the cathedral square, an image that Niles paints with moving parallel fourths in the accompaniment, which gives the musical effect of hearing what, if you could hear this, it's like hearing light-dappled cathedral domes, just hearing the light bounce off the roof of this church. Two recurring musical themes throughout the pieces in the Niles-Merton songs can be found in this one. So first, the use of triplets, which is when you group 3 notes together in one beat, such as you'll hear in the line, silver cock, cock in the wind, sun cock, paralyzed in a desert of roofs. So you can almost hear the da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, right? So you'll hear Betsy singing these triplets. Poor tin Don Juan, cathedral ascetic, he knows no other corn than the sky's kind. The second theme that Niles goes back to repeatedly is a motif that we will have already heard in the first piece, the ascending and descending scale patterns, which comes from his folk background, really. Sometimes it's a solo line, sometimes it's parallel thirds, sometimes parallel fourths. This piece ends with a very unfinished sound, which is characteristic of this whole song cycle. Some people say that it's because of Niles' interest in impressionist music, where the piece is sort of this brief glimpse. So if you think about it, if you're walking through a major city and you glance up at the cathedral, you're looking at it for a moment, And then the moment passes, and you think, ooh, churros, and you move on, right? And so there's no completion where you think, and now I'm ending my view, and now I will go get some snacks. It sort of is this impression that the cathedral would make on you, and then just as quickly as it's there, it kind of vanishes into thin air. So perhaps that's the way you could understand the sort of unfinished ending of this piece. So there's no analysis drawn about what we've seen and heard. The weather vane is not meant to be some deep metaphor that we are, trying to grasp. We are really just, this is sort of the influence of Zen Buddhism. We're looking, we're contemplating, we are appreciating what we see in the moment and accepting it. So we're living mindfully in reality rather than dissecting and analyzing it. Our third piece is entitled Evening. The vocal line begins in a monotone, right? So that's when one note is repeated over and over and over again. Don't worry, it's more exciting than it sounds. So there's a repeated open fifth in the piano's bass line. And for a while, the piece sort of hovers around A flat and G. It goes up, it goes down, but it's sort of right between these two notes until the lines, they say they love the orchards and apple trees, the trees, their innocent sisters dressed in blossoms, still wearing in the blurring dusk white dresses from that morning's first communion. So in that passage, you're going to hear the voice singing the same monotone, but it's going to be almost chanted with the melody rising note by note each time, and it's going to go the whole way from a G up to an E flat. And all the while, the piano accompaniment is going to be rippling, driving the piece forward. Also notice, in the quote that I just read from the poem, the commingling of religious and nature imagery. So the spring blossoms on the trees are compared to the innocence of a girl receiving her first communion, right? The trees with their white blossoms are dressed for this pure and sacred event of a spring evening. So it's really a lovely image, especially considering that this is the season that we're in. Lilies and birds are also evoked, as are the limpid, clean spring landscapes. And so it's neat to know, okay, this is really from the first couple of years that Merton was living at this monastery in Kentucky, and he's just enjoying the new landscape. He had lived in England, he had lived in New York City, in fairly urban areas for the most part. And so coming to this rural part of Kentucky was something that was a real release for him. And then the last piece from the first opus, so that's the first group of four, is Prayer, or Great Prayer. In this song, Niles presents a more varied melody, with more frequent, larger leaps in the vocal line. The overall tone is very contemplative and peaceful. Large portions have a recitative style, where the melody is kind of mimicking the natural rise and fall of the voice. So the voice is almost chattering or chanting the poem's lyrics. So you're going to hear a lot of wordiness in this particular song, like in the line, "Dream is a solitary rock where the soul's hawk nests," right? And so there's not really a melody, it's just a very natural melodic line following the contours of the voice the way that we might speak. The melody is also very syncopated. It lulls the listener into rest, as though we are dreaming too while we're awake, and very attuned to the world. The next song is perhaps Merton's most famous poem, certainly one of his most moving, For My Brother Reported Missing in Action, 1943. It's written as an elegy for his younger brother, John Paul, who died in World War II. Just before John Paul left for the front, he spent some days at Gethsemane with Merton and was baptized into the Catholic Church. This was actually a real, it would have been a special moment for Merton regardless, but it was particularly poignant because Merton felt that he had been a poor example to his younger brother through his younger years, and felt that it was too late, now that he became a monk, to really do anything. And I think that he just felt a sense of relief that his brother had found peace before he went into war, regardless of what the outcome was. So the piece begins with a very sparse accompaniment. It's a very dark tonality. It's set in G minor. The range is generally significantly lower throughout to underscore the phrase, particularly sweet brother. You're going to hear this very chesty, low note when that phrase comes up a couple of times. And then also in the melody, you're going to hear dotted rhythms, which kind of evoke the breathlessness of a sob. You know, I mean, I don't know if guys get this, but girls will. So, you know when you're crying really hard and you're just trying to catch your breath, and so there's almost this, it's just a little bit off kilter, and the melody has that with the dots. So hopefully you'll hear that as well, because it's very distinctive compared to his other piece. The other thing that really stands out is the final lines, which are marked in the music as a funeral dirge, a funeral march. So the piece marches to the end with this very funereal, grave quality. But then the final chord is what we call in music a Picardy third, which means that it ends on a major chord. So just when you're thinking all is dark and hopeless, all is not lost. So the piece does not end actually in despair, even though it's filled with very personal grief. It winds up on a note of hope. Next is a setting of Merton's poem, The Greek Women. And I'll tell you, the first time I read this poem, the lyrics seem kind of purely literary. It's an ode to the classical women of ancient Greece. And the words, again, are really, there's almost like an automatopoeia to them. There's a texture to the words of the poem. So we can hear the women's bracelets jangling on their wrists and the fabric of their luxurious clothing softly rustling with their graceful movements. However, midway through the piece, you're going to hear an abrupt change in the tone, and we find out that the piece is not an innocent poetic reflection on these Greek women of the classical age, but rather a social critique of violence and the extravagances of urban life. So you'll see in the poem, in the last few stanzas, the preparations of the Greek women for their husbands coming home, which is what they're doing. They're bathing and perfuming themselves and getting their house ready for their husbands to return home from war. But these preparations prove futile. Their men have already died in battle. The cities are burning to the ground. And if you look at the text, you'll see that Merton uses the words willow women towards the beginning, and with the change of one letter, those become widow women, right? So there's that interesting flip there. What use are their jewels to them now? And the lush reds of their dresses, instead of being a symbol of wealth and extravagance, become the foreshadowing of the blood on Clytemnestra's knife that she uses to kill Agamemnon, right? He's the one man who returns from battle, but he's not home for very long. So here we see this very characteristic theme, especially in early Merton poetry. He leaves the world to enter the monastery, and the poems in the first few years are highly skeptical of the modern city, of modern Western culture, and of modern man himself. He sort of has this sense that a lot of people have this kind of violence boiling underneath them, waiting for it to spill out. So it's this almost Hobbesian view of the person and the state that you'll hear at the end of this poem. And this piece, too, has an odd, unfinished ending, almost like a question mark. Carrying on with one of Merton's earlier themes of the rejection of secular city life, the Ohio River, Louisville, displays Merton's love for nature alongside his distaste for encroaching urban life, which mechanized what he thought of as the gratuitous beauty of the outdoors. You know, rain is just freely given. You don't buy it, you don't commodify it. And yet he says that in this famous essay, Rain and the Rhinoceros, if the utility companies could commodify rain and charge us for it, they would, right? So he's got this very skeptical attitude about contemporary life. So in this piece, you might notice the accompanist using a nifty tool, about this long, and it's used to create large chord clusters on the piano. Do you have it, or is it up at the piano? Oh, okay, yeah. It's a piece of plastic and a sock, so nothing too high tech here. But it's going to sound amazing when you listen to it. So just know that she's using a kind of postmodern technique in doing this that's right in the music. And so the dissonance that chord cluster creates is sometimes sparkling, like you're hearing the light refracting off the water. Other times it's kind of unpleasant and a little unsettling. It doesn't feel super good. So there's the sense then of, okay, we're in this place on the riverbank having a swim, we're far from city life where there's all those factories and advertisements and the hustle and bustle. We're here in the quiet where you can't hear the noise of the city. It's great. And yet, despite this peace, the city still encroaches and human beings are still there swimming. So you get this kind of odd last verse where even though we're far from the city's buzz, we've got this disturbing image of a mosquito's bloodlust compared to human violence kind of simmering underneath our skin. So even though we're just having a nice day paddling in the river or tubing, below the skin is that Hobbesian personality again. And you know, if everything were to fall apart, we'd just all be against one another. So deceptively calm and peaceful, that Ohio River piece. Another thing to listen for in that is dynamics. The words, as you'll see, reflect loudness and softness. You'll hear it in the music as well. Our final piece today will be Mosaic St Prax. It's the last piece of Niles' 2 song cycles. It begins with a brighter, more positive tone, which is nice because we've had a few dark ones before this. The melodic motifs of triplets and these rippling scale passages are both present in full force. And there's a sense of genuine rest and peace as Merton is sitting in a chapel and we with him contemplate a mosaic of the Virgin Mary. So in this sacred space, Merton is able to move beyond what he considers to be the painfulness and violence of life, not by denying that they exist, but by recognizing how they're inextricably linked to the joys and sorrows of Mary, the Mother of God. So much so that forgetting the deepest evils of the world, we can, as Merton writes, sail above our strange agony. Again, this piece remains unresolved at the end, but this time the lack of a closing chord seems like an invitation to go deeper rather than something unsatisfying. We are called to come and see what Merton is seeing, to share in this Zen vision, in a way, of the world that he sees, to enter into a pure, unadulterated contemplation of life, accepting it, resting in it, rather than trying to control or manipulate it for our own purposes. So that's the talk. I want to give you one note on performance etiquette before we get started. So because this is a song cycle and it's meant to be heard as a whole, like I was talking about, we ask that you save all applause until after each opus is completed. So we'll listen to the first 4 songs, clapping, the next 4 songs, massive clapping, okay? So just to coach you on that. And just so, you know, especially if you're taking a date to the symphony or something like that, this is a great way to impress them. You'll know that you don't clap between movements, you clap at the big breaks, right? When the conductor puts his hands down, then you know, okay, this is us. So I want to introduce our performers today, soprano Elizabeth Springle and pianist Barbara Brown, and I hope you enjoy the concert. Thank you.
the dead are not yet dead, and that the living live apart, and that the wounded are healing, though in a place of flame. The sick in a great ship are riding, they are riding home. Suppose the dead could crown their wit with some intemperate exercise, spring wine from their ivory, or roses from their eyes. Two cities sailed together for many thousand years, and now they drift asunder. The tides of new war sweep the sad heavens, divide the massed stars, the black and white universe, the booming of the spheres. Down, 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 the white armies fall. The white armies fall, moving their ordered snows toward the jaws of hell. Suppose the dead could crown their wit with some intemperate exercise, spring wine from their ivory, or roses from their eyes. Oh, the cock on the weather vane cannot flap his wings, even though today is his saint's day. Today is his saint's day, and the sun spreads its green yellow carpet in the courtyard as Ana del Campo passes by, sunshine on Saint's Day. Gold quilts on the balconies, diamonds on the roofs, domes and towers, for Ana del Campo has come with her nose in the air. Adieu, damsel. Oh, the cock would like to crow. Morton Don Juan, stuck on his belfry as clouds wheel around him in his blue hanyard. The burning bird flashes. Silver cock in the wind, sun cock paralyzed in a desert of roofs. Portent on one cathedral ascetic, he knows no other corn than the sky's kind. Hail, hail, hail. And as Ana del Campo goes by, he flashes sun signals to his friend, the lightning rod. Anna, take me to the door of your house of flowers where bliss never ends. Give me your cool to warm my throat of sand. Give me your lily field. Yourself of clouds and windows talking among themselves, talking like violins, 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 and opening their eyes, as wide as horizons, seem to await the navy home from Troy. No longer stand together, widow, widow women, give your gold ornaments to the poor, the poor, the poor. Make run a water speech of beads between your fingers, for Troy is burned and Greece is cursed. A plague comes like a cloud, all your men are sleeping in the alien earth, but one. And Clytemnestra, walking like a willow, stares, beads and bracelets, gently knife clash all about her, because the conqueror, the home-come hero, the soldier Agamemnon, bleeds in her conscience, twisting like a root. No one can hear the loud voice of the city because of the tremendous silence of the slow-moving river. Not the towering bridge, the crawling train, not the knives of pylons clashing in the sun, and not the sky-swung cables, not the outboard motor, swearing in the fiery distance, swearing like a locust, not the iron cries of men, nothing is heard, only the immense and silent movement of the river. The trains go through the summer, white as paper, and in the powerhouse the singing dynamos make no more noise than cotton. Life is quieter than the weeds, on which lies lightly sprawling, like white birds shot to death, the bather's clothing.